Me just share my screen and start the slide. And I hope you can all see my slides, and that's the slides I will be used for the presentation today. So we'll go ahead and get it started. I'm really excited to see people are joining as we speak. So thank you for being here today. And good morning, everyone. So thank you for being here today. My name is Sitong Liu, and I'm really excited to share some of my insights on a topic that's dear to me and deeply relevant to my practice as a psychotherapist working with Asian immigrants and Asian American community. And the topic I would like to explore with you guys today is the mental health of immigrants. And this essential question I often find them ask themselves: where do I belong? And where is the home? And I can tell you, as an immigrant myself, this is the very question I have asked myself at times during my immigration journey. And I often hear that from the clients. They all come ask, but whatever they're coming in for mental health treatment, whether that's depression, anxiety, grief, or just stress management. At one point, almost in that journey, searching for their identity and the mental health, they all comes back to this topic: where do I belong? Like I don't know where is home. I don't know where I can feel truly accepted. Right. So I think that's actually really relevant, important questions for us as a service provider to understand what kind of things that's been contributing to the sense of belonging, and how can we work with people, understanding like the experience that they have, and how can we work in a sense to foster and restore that sense of belonging, to start a healing. And I had the privilege to explore this sense of belonging, and the connection with mental health through my work as a psychotherapist. And I think this not only coming out from the mental health field, like other like a community organization work as well, like that sense of belonging. How can we do something, right? Like at the larger scales, or even with the individual work to restore that. And so today we're going to explore the psychological experience of a belonging for immigrants and some of the frameworks that's going to help us understand this complex issue. I think there are so many emotions and feelings behind the sense of belonging, how someone see themselves and see the connection they have with the world around them. So it is different frameworks for us just to conceptualize this issue. And at the end, we're going to talk about some of the interventions that I find helpful that can foster a sense of belonging. And then at the end, we'll go into like the Q&A. And also I would love to hear from all of you. Like I know you're coming from different area, different background. I want to hear from all of you what kind of things you find helpful when working with a culturally diverse population. We're coming from different area of the world. What kind of things that was helpful for you to help them foster the sense of belonging? So we'll go, that's the what we're going to get into today. And a little bit about me. I just said at the beginning, my name is Sitong Liu. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm based here in the greater Philadelphia area. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm affiliated with Mainline Health and Mango Tree Counseling and Consulting. I graduated from University of Pennsylvania, and I've been working in the direct patient care setting since. My work at Mango Tree specifically allows me to work with the immigrant community by providing culturally affirming care and trauma-informed care. And for those that's not familiar with Mango Tree, it is a mental health resource center that focusing on the needs of Asian immigrants and Asian American communities. And I have been working with individuals as well as a group through psychotherapy to explore areas like racial and cultural identity, trauma, working with them. My specialty is anxiety, depression, trauma. So like along with those line, I was able to explore what's been impacting them about mental health. And a sense of belonging, I find that it oftentimes felt like a point of a contention in someone's identity. And that correlates to, has a direct connection with the mental health, how they see themselves, how they feel like where they can feel truly belong and be seen and be understood and be part of something where they recognize and have this positive feelings about. So oftentimes it is about addressing the symptoms for anxiety and depression, right? What we're seeing coming in with the diagnosis. But a lot of time that goes beyond like what we can provide at an individual level. It goes beyond like it's at a family function. It's at a bigger connection with how they connect with the community. So that point of contention has always been this identity of how they see themselves and how they felt relate and connect with other people. So these are some of the learning objectives that we're going to hopefully get through today. We're going to explore the psychological experience of a belonging for immigrants. And we're also going to look at some of the frameworks that help us understand and conceptualize this complex issue of the psychological of belonging and some of the interventions that can help us foster a sense of belonging for immigrants. All right. And to start, I think it is kind of important for us also to define what we mean by belonging, right? It is such a subjective term, like how one sees themselves. I will share some definition today with you to hopefully help us understand this concept. But I can tell you already now, like all of these concepts and definitions I'm going to share, they all manifest into this feelings and longing for connection, acceptance, inclusion, and attachment to a group or broader society. It is it definitely has multiple layers underneath this psychological experience, and it has so many emotions and feelings underneath love and belonging. And I already right here, I have a triangle here that draws from the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I think that's one way for us to look at this issue. So according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, like there's a different level of needs one need to satisfy before they can move to another. Love and belonging right here, you can see like it says right in the middle, and with belonging be one of them. It is a fundamental human needs, meaning that it's crucial for human to feel to able to achieve themselves and survive. So people will choose their behaviors in a way to satisfy this need. So it's always something someone chase for, someone longing for to feel loved and feel belong to somewhere. And in other ways, people will try to establish attachment, right? Knowing that belonging is what they need before they can achieve a self-esteem and self-actualization. They will try to establish attachment to a group that they have a positive feelings about and where they feel like they can belong. So starting with, like it says, right, like actually in the middle, right, like that says the first two layers, this physiological needs and the safety. These are what we consider the basic needs for someone to survive, like the very basic needs as humans, right? Things like food, water, shelter, clothing, reproduction, and these are the physiological needs, like that has to be met before someone can seek to establish safety. So things like economic job security, personal security, health, right? Property, have a place to live. These are the area that you had to store to feel like you feel safe, right? Then we move to like the very next part. Once these basic needs are addressed, the very next thing, and instead of addressing what they need, they look for what's around them, right? Like they are looking for love and belonging. So these are the things that's the needs can only be met by interaction with someone else, right? Things like a friendship, intimacy with someone, have a connection with the family, or even this sense of connection with at a different setting with somebody else. Then someone, once that's established, they feel loved and they feel like they can belong somewhere. They move to like building that self-esteem, right? Like they feel what they are competent of. They can pursue what's important to them. That's essentially the self-actualization, become someone that's the most they can become. So that way, I hope this hierarchy help you to understand that the love and belonging, that's actually essential to, it's a human needs just as much as what we need, like 8 cups of water a day, right? As much as we need that, we also need a sense of belonging to have a sense saying like I am important, I am connected to someone, and I had to have this needs met before I can really achieve something else for myself. So that's one way to look at like a sense of belonging, the importance of that and what it means. I have another definition here I want to share with you guys. It's from Cornell University and Sense of Belonging Study. So the definition goes, belonging is a feeling of security and support when there is a sense of acceptance, inclusion, and identity for a member of certain group. So from this definition, we know that belonging is not just about being part of a group. It's not about just affiliation, right? You can join as many groups as you want, but it's more about this feelings of acceptance and inclusion. So it involves much more than just affiliation or title. It involves the emotional connection. So it is about the feelings that our presence matters and our contributions are valued. So when the sense of belonging this type of sense of belonging can happen in many places. It can happen in the family, with friends, workplace with coworkers, with a bigger community, sometimes even the online space with the online community. It is about like what we say matters and what we say can be understood. So it's the emotional experience someone has. Another definition I want to share with you guys here is a definition from several research about sense of belonging. And it says a sense of belonging can be defined as a highly subjective and dynamic feelings of acceptance, inclusion, and connectiveness with a specific contextual entity. And what's the key points about this definition is sense of belonging is definitely highly subjective, right? It's a deeply personal and vary from one person to another, right? People can belong to the same group or same club, but they might have a totally different experience about how much they felt belong and accepted. It's very subjective, right? It's hard to really put a finger. It's hard to even measure that. So it's a very subjective, and it's a dynamic, right? You change it from place to place, and you can change it from time to time. But someone may feel like have a more sense of a belonging at home than the other community. Some people might feel like they're connected to the peers at school, right? What specific group with the identity that they belong versus they might feel like they've been rejected at home. It's definitely very dynamic, and it can certain change, right? Like with sometimes I see that as the new immigrants coming in, there's a lot of barriers for them to feel belong, right? Because there are a lot of them coming from here starting from scratch. It's harder to really have that connection. So I mean, they might not feel belong, right? Like if that belonging can be fostered and built through the period of time with the social network, or maybe they add maybe 5 years into the immigration, right? Or like later on when they find a community where they felt belong, and they might have a more sense of belonging. So it definitely changes from time to time. And it all goes back to this idea about the feeling being it's the sense of belonging, but it's also the sense of feeling accepted, feeling like you are being included, right? You are part of something, and this is a heartwarming feeling like, oh, I do belong here, right? I do feel like I have similarity. I do feel like my experience and my cultural background is seen and understood. And that's the type of belonging we're talking about here today. We want to focus on this subjective and lived experience of someone. So this perceived belongingness is not about like how other people see us. It's not about the group affiliation. It's more than that, right? It can be about them, but it's more than about this perceived belongingness, someone how they see themselves and how that impacts our mental health. And many research had indicated that belonging is a subjective experience, and it's shaped by the interaction that we have with other people in the social environment. So when immigrants feel that they are valued and accepted by the host community, they tend to do better with their physical and mental health and overall wellness. And on the opposite side, it is also true that a lack of a belonging can lead to significant mental health challenges, and that includes anxiety and depression and decrease the sense of self-worth. So it is actually very important here. It's a needs, right? It's a basic needs that has to get met before someone can feel truly accepted. So we want to focus on this perceived belongingness and how that impacts us. There are some many ways how sense of belonging can show up in different forms, and how the implication goes in many ways. And the research that I found, they consistently show that a strong sense of belonging is linked to many positive outcomes. So the first one is physical health, that mind-body connection. I'm actually surprised to find like a sense of belonging, how that can improve some of our mental health. So for someone that actually have a higher sense of belonging or higher satisfaction with the community, truly felt belong, they actually have improved immune function, a lower stress level, and a lower chance for chronic disease like cardiac disease that can be based from chronic stress. And when someone feel more connected to a community, they have a strong sense of belonging. They also have that experience of less pain, right? Like these are how that show up physiologically with the mental health. And the same goes well as true with mental health. A strong sense of belonging is associated with increased life satisfaction and the lower risk for depression and anxiety. When someone feel like they belong to a social community, they often help them to reinforce this idea there's a sense of meaning in life and life is worth living, right? Like I think as a psychotherapist, I see that a lot of time with depression and anxiety, it comes up from the sense of hopelessness, right? Like a sense of feeling isolated. So these are the risk factors for suicide ideations, depression, and anxiety. But when someone has this sense of meaning in life, meaning that they can identify life is worth living for. There are protective factors in place, and they have probably more social resilience, right? Life is worth meaning, and they are more likely to access support. So with that actually has served as a buffer for stress and the mental health when someone has felt like they belong somewhere. And that's also true at workplace, right? Like with work performance, many people find that this sense of belonging actually foster this emotional connection and engagement at work, regardless what type of work that you have. So people that feel that they belong are more likely to report higher job satisfaction and remain at the organization. So like talent retention is also important from this perspective. When someone feel connected, welcomed, right? Like they also have this sense that they are valued, and as well as their contributions. So they can bring their whole and authentic self, without fear of being judged. So they were more likely to share openly and honestly about their thoughts and experience, and further create a better work outcome with diverse ideas and different perspectives. So these are at the individual level, how sense of belonging can impact us. And that's also true at the larger scale with the civic engagement, right, that help foster this sense of trust to the local government and larger entities, and higher satisfaction with the local community, and therefore create a social cohesion and less conflicts. So these are all some of the positive things that, right, when someone feels have a sense of belonging, that can bring us. And I think it's also important for us to recognize the dark side, right? Non-belonging that's also very present at the society currently. Many immigrants actually experience a social exclusion, and that can severely impact their health and well-being. In fact, there's a study from the American Immigration Council back in 2022, and they revealed that nearly 64% of individuals reported feeling of non-belonging at their workplace. And 67% of immigrants feel not belonging in their community. That's nearly 70% of people feel like they don't belong, right, at the workplace, at the community, which I think with current society, that's the two places we actually exist, is the home, work, and community. Most of them don't feel like they connect, we belong. They feel like some way of being excluded. And with that type of social exclusion, that actually lead to like a lower self-worth, right? They don't feel like they're important, right? Like their contribution, their voice don't matter because they don't belong. And that created from the sense of meaning can easily turn to the feeling of meaningless and hopeless. And that contribute to a lot of symptoms that we see here for depression and anxiety, and how that's like a vicious cycle, right? Like if someone's starting isolating, even if they want to feel included, but there's no such a space, that's further create that cycle of feeling isolated, but unable to really find a place where they feel belong. It's harder to get out from that depression cycle. The next part, I also want to talk a little bit about intersectionality. I think it's a concept that's going to help us understand how some of the overlapping identities like race, gender, socioeconomic status, immigration status as well, how that can impact the sense of belonging. And intersectionality, for those that might not be as familiar, is a framework that help us understand how someone's social identity or political identity can result in both way, right? It can be create an experience of oppression and privilege at the same time. And so sense of belonging is not like a uniform experience, and it actually varies based on the interactions with those identities. So marginalized groups oftentimes will face additional challenge. So for example, like immigrants who are also racial minority in the United States, or someone that's identified as a queer might encounter additional layer of discrimination and exclusions, and that directly impact their sensibility to belong. A few things I listed here with the race being, I think, the major one, race and ethnicity. Just like the American citizen that's born and raised here, they go through the racialization of how they perceive their own race and other races. Immigrants coming to this country also go through that process of being racialized and how they perceive themselves and feeling being accepted by the society. And I will talk more about how that impacts and shapes the sense of belonging later on. And another important things to note here is also gender. Right? Gender dynamics have created that unique challenges. Like an immigrant woman oftentimes face both like a gender and a cultural-based discrimination. And the socioeconomic status that goes without saying, right? Someone that's coming in with more access for like immigrant coming in here to pursue better job and education, which already have a resource, right? That help them to probably feel like more belong, has more connection to the social network versus someone coming or fleed from war and poverty coming here to face better greater challenges. Another important thing is maintaining, of course, like immigration status. And that can really complicate the sense of belonging, especially those with temporary status and undocumented status. They may feel especially isolated because the legal process and because it's such a marginalized area, like with little support, oftentimes feel like they are left alone. So that further created that the barrier. So understanding like an intersectional identities is also understand that individuals' psychological experience is as much as it's about how they see themselves, it's also about those overlapping, how intersectional, right? Like working with immigrant women definitely is different like working with immigrant men, right? The race that they have, right, is that preferred race in the United States, where some of the race that can be penalized or be perceived as unwelcomed, right, undesirable. So all these things are adding up to that sense of belonging as well. And to fully grasp the psychological belonging, there are some frameworks that's going to help us understand, and I will go through them, each of them as we go. So the first one is person in environment, and that's the framework that's going to explore the interplay between someone's personal experience to the broader socioeconomic factors. So the social environment, how that transaction played out. So it highlights the influence from the social environment to the sense of belonging. Othering and racism, I think, is also an important one to point out. It help us to understand how systemic racism and xenophobia can create a feeling of alienation. So some of the narratives, right? Some of the narratives around immigration often frame, I think especially nowadays, like frame immigrants as others, right? That further perpetuates the social exclusion, the outer group, right? The outsider feeling, and how that impacts the sense of belonging, the personal psychological experience of someone. Trauma is also another very important piece here, that's that psychological wound someone carried through the immigration journey. And it has a profound impact on someone's sense of belonging and their mental health as well. traumatic experience like violence, right, war, crime, even face discrimination and microaggression when they're as try to assimilate here, that can create some of the barriers for to form the connection with someone. And the last one is resilience, right? It's more focused on the strengths and coping mechanisms someone already have. So we look at the capacity of someone, how they can adapt positively to the challenges, right? How quickly they can bounce back to where they were. So, and then many immigrants that I work with, they're actually incredibly resilient, right? Like they develop the resilience through the community support that they have and through the strength that they have within themselves. And that oftentimes when they use the resilience protective factors, that can help them enhance that sense of belonging. So the first framework, let's dive a little bit deeper here, is the socioeconomic context, and that's often referred to as the person in environmental perspective. So this is a perspective that emphasizes the influence on the socioeconomic and the cultural factors on the immigrant's sense of belonging. So right here, you will see in the center there's a different circle that kind of speak to that experience, how they interact with one another. So at the core is the micro level. It's a level with just at a very individual level, focus on the experience of someone's individual experience. There are many factors that can influence someone's sense of belonging. So let's say someone's attitudes and beliefs, right? The thought process that they have, right? Like that's tend to be the level that I work with as a therapist, right? Someone's thought process can look like, do they have a rigid thinking, right? Do they see things as a black and white? Either I belong or I don't belong, right? Like that kind of thinking, that's kind of hard to really find where you can find truly belong. Because a lot of times that falls into that in between, right? I don't really, the example of a more balanced thinking will be, I don't feel belong at work, but I do feel belong at my community, right? I do feel well connected to my religious community, right? If they have that more psychological flexibility, more likely they will see themselves to have the connection, therefore have that sense of belonging. If they have a more of that rigid thinking, right, very black and white, all or nothing, it's harder for them to truly feel like accepted and truly feel like they do really belong. And with that type of thinking, that also goes to someone's behaviors, right? Like that influences someone's behavior. Do they tend to isolate, right? Like is isolating help them to create a sense of belonging and connection with someone, or is do they tend to like proactively seek for support and help, and therefore help them to build a community that on their own. So their individual behaviors also shape how they can relate to other people and a sense of belonging. And the cultural identity that they come in is also another one. So the cultural identity of themselves, right, like is that different than the host community they're coming in, and the cultural familiarity that they have, right, like that created that barrier. Oftentimes, working with Asian immigrants, I find out that there's a huge cultural gap for them to assimilate to the United States, because the cultural background, most of them have like collectivism versus here the individualism and culture. So that familiarity, like ability to adapt, it's also going to influence that sense of belonging, how quickly they can find a sense of belonging and connection with someone. Someone at the individual level, trauma history is another great one. Trauma history actually influence how they see themselves. Can they truly relate to someone? Can they also feel like people can understand their experience? Is there a safe space for them to talk about their trauma, to share about what's like with their immigration story? And the individual level, another thing with immigrants, I think, is language. Obviously, with the culture, it also comes with language, right? So the native language that they have and the language proficiency that they have for the host community. Right, like that's the first way to really build a connection is actually talk to someone, right? Establish a connection. If the language barriers are so severe, it's harder for their ability to truly make that connection and build a relationship with someone. And someone's right, like the attitudes towards like how they see themselves, that can be even before the immigration journey, how before, during, and after, actually, right? Like how can that they see themselves, the attitude towards themselves and the world. And these are all the factors that's going to make things harder or easier for someone. Then we move to the meso level. That's the immediate environment when someone interact with, right? Think about things like the people's families, peers, people where they go to work, the cultural background that they have, the community they are in, right? So that's the relationships that someone develops with. So things like with the peer, how good do they have a good relationship with the peer? What kind of family environment that they are? Do they even feel accepted by their own community? Working with Asian queer, I think this comes up a lot where they don't feel like they are accepted, understood by their family. There's a lot of resentment. There's a lot of feeling like my family doesn't get me, and that's a really devastating feeling to carry. But they might also find that they related to the peers or who share the similar identity. That also is true, I think, with the ethno-cultural background, the cultural diversity at the local community, right? This comes out a lot of working with someone, like if someone grew up in the predominantly white neighborhood, right? That sense of, right, like maybe at a very young age, they already learned like I'm different. Right? Like I had to find my way to feel like connect and belong. It's like a really effortful. They had to make the extra efforts to truly feel connected, belong, or even had to hide some of the cultural heritage, right, to like really blend in. So like the cultural diversity in the local community is also another great factors. So people, let's say someone that grew up in a more like Asian immigrant community where they feel like everybody goes through this, right? Things like people from New York, people from California, like Sacramento. Like if their community, they also feel like they do feel belong because their cultural practice is largely understood, that they feel like their culture and the cultural experience that they have is a shared experience between them and the community around them. And another thing is about the diversity in the workplace too, as well. Workplace and school, if someone goes to school, all these things kind of build in that socialization and how they see themselves. Social capital at this meso level is another good one. A social capital, that's the informal social network someone will have, right? Like the informal connection someone will have. So that actually created access to resource, information, and access to opportunity. So someone has a strong social network when they already come here. Maybe they already know someone, or if through their work they were able to build an informal network with the community. They actually probably have a higher level of sense of belonging. And on the opposite side, those in isolation, they don't have much access to resource information. They tend to struggle a little bit more. The same way here with your interaction with someone's interaction to the environment is the immigration status. And that can profoundly, I think this alone impact their feelings of belonging. And for many immigrants, navigating a new culture and a new language alone can be isolating and challenging. And those with a complicated immigration status actually experience greater challenges. And it's actually very important for us to recognize those complexities. With the immigration status, right, like it's important, but it also doesn't really totally resolve the sense of belonging. I have worked with like people that already have permanent residence status or even pursued citizenship, children of immigrants, right? Like immigration status is not something they have to worry about, but still they ask themselves, right? Like, where do I belong? Oftentimes I hear people describe this code switching efforts that they have to do, like between home and the community, or between home and work, where they feel like either side that they are like partially belong to either side, but not fully, right? Like that confusion, that ambiguity with where they truly belong. So immigration status is important, but it actually doesn't resolve. And it's experienced by immigrants across all status, right? From permanent status to no status, undocumented, temporary status, and the refugee status. All these things, they actually find the sense of belonging that impact their way to relate and feel accepted by the society. And then we all know like how complicated the immigration system is in the United States, right? Like there's a lot of category, right? There's a lot of regulation that can make you someone to feel like they're at risk of losing that status, right? That with the law that we have here, what's unique is actually there's the category, that in between category, right? People like with temporary status, they have the temporary rights to stay, live and work, study here, but there's no actually pathway to help them get permanent residence with citizenship. So that in between status create another ambiguity for those people. So that is actually called the liminal status by the legal scholar to describe this category in the immigration. So people like international students, people with temporary work visa, people have temporary protected status, and DACA recipients. So these are people fall between that, either have a permanent status or no status. And that process alone is very stressful and can be traumatic. Really worry a lot about those things because there's a lot of ambiguity, right? I think with a sense of belonging first is to establish, right, like group affiliation, because there's that such ambiguity in how they see themselves, and the status will presenting to the society is harder for them to find that niche group, that very small group with the needs to feel belong, and the experience that they go through with that status. So immigration status actually, like with the community, I think it is really relevant and present right here at the meso level. Now the next one is the macro level. It's the larger society, is that circle at the outer circle that you see here. So that's the cultural environment, right? Like people live in. So the society's values, cultural norms, laws and policies, and all these things kind of influence how someone and how someone's life experience can be. With the immigration law here that we know like that impact a lot about immigration status, that also impact people's access to healthcare, their access to employment, community service, and that can in another way impact their sense of belonging and how they can see themselves if they have a status to be here. The next part is othering and racism. I also want to recognize the role of racism and how that perpetuates these feelings of isolation and marginalization in the immigrant community. We can take a close look at here, like how racism, right, like oftentimes that show up as discrimination and microaggression, and how that affects immigrants' sense of belonging. And then there actually is also another barrier for belonging for many immigrants. For the US citizen, right, everyone that live, born and raised here, they are racialized to see how one race may be like more superior than the other, right? Like a racialized experience. Same way as immigrants before they come here, right? There's already almost like a labor already put in them, right? And that further with the racialization, they come in, like they also kind of learn how navigate, also learn how race and racism operates in the US society. And that can create a lot of social alienation in that process. And that further, I think that's perpetuated by some of the negative public views that we have, right? And the narratives that we have, and the political rhetorics that we have for the immigrant community. So these are the systemic barrier. If you think about that, the micro, meso, macro level, these are the macro level someone is out there for someone to create that barrier for them to feel connected, right? That with the racism and othering practice that we see here, that reinforce the outsider status, someone coming in, right? We often hear a lot of labors putting people like putting them as others, as outsiders, and that further like I think reinforced over and over again when they interact with the system. And they also face a lot of stigmatization, and they've been viewed as outsiders because of the stigma that been put on them. And as we all hear, I don't have to give you the whole history lesson, but we all hear like we all know there's a legal legacy. There are many laws and policies in the past to exclude certain race and ethnicities, right? The Chinese Exclusion Act back in the 50s and 60s, right? Like these are the immigration law that was out there to other and to reinforce the racism practice. So belonging in the United States is actually affected by those legal legacy and how that contribute to racialized views and policies. And with those laws and policy, what we see here is they favors people with certain nationalities, ethnicities, and skin tone. With I think the Muslim ban is another good example of how that favor plays out when with that legal legacy. Like it's harder for those people, for the immigration, for the immigrants community of the Muslim community to feel like they have a space, right, with their very own existence can be viewed as dangerous or unwelcome, right, undesirable. And that's also true not only with the Muslim community. I think many non-white and lower class immigrants, they are regarded as undesirable and unwelcome. And there's that political rhetoric that we hear today to reinforce this stereotype and this view. And also, and with this process, right, like that's when the othering happens, and where people they don't see them as a part of the group, and that affect their ability to see themselves really connect and build that authentic connection with someone. With racism and the immigration, I think it's also true to recognize the polarization that's going around with the issue of immigrants, right? And there's a lot of policy I agree needed to be reinforced, but also in that process, I think what to put a lot of immigrants in the whole community and as victim in that process, because there are a lot of untrue and stereotype and stigmatization going on. And that causes a lot of chronic stress of feeling unsafe and threatened by those policy and the rhetorics. On the other side, it's harder for them to really truly feel like they belong as a border society. They belong to this community society, the very country they want to move here and to be part of and contribute. With the racism and the other part is also othering. Othering is a phenomenon. That's the othering is a phenomenon that's putting people out in the outer group, right? It's always them versus us, right? Putting them is seen as something othering as dangerous as and reinforces xenophobia. And some example with othering looks like the first one is a language barrier, right? With the non-native speakers, they oftentimes feel excluded in social situation with the language skills. And so with the language skills, it's harder for them to really fully participate. So language barrier, or if they are in an institute, let's say school or work, if there's no accommodation for that language, it's harder for them to participate in the activities. That's a systemic othering that's happening. Cultural stereotyping is also another one example of othering. Cultural stereotyping happens with a lot of time it feels like a microaggression that happened at work, making it challenging for them feel to being accepted and feel like their contribution valued because they're being perceived as others. They're always someone be picked on and be chose to picked on against. So what happened with this process is the racialization of migrants, that through discrimination, microaggression. Very soon as they landed in the United States, I think people realized how racism function, right? Either through their lived experience or from the stories that they hear from others. And they realize like what one race is more desirable, right? Like over than the other. Either they reinforce that racism view themselves, or they kind of feel like, okay, I'm not safe here. And that further create that internalized, right? Like a lot of people internalize that to themselves and start self-othering, right? When the environment is not feeling them included, they also start isolating themselves. And that's harder, that social alienation, right? Like putting them in a marginalized position to reach out, right? To access support, to advocate for themselves. So this internalized alienation happens over and over. Sometimes we see that at the individual level and it passed down through generation as well. And that can create that devastating factor to the mental health, right? Like that systemic alienation, as isolation. It's harder for someone to really step up and see themselves in this place. The next part, I want to also talk about trauma and the grief. I think it's just so prevalent in the community that we serve. the trauma is goes without saying is that psychological wound someone carries in the immigration process. And that oftentimes I think immigration process alone can be very traumatic. It depends on the circumstances of immigration. Many immigrants and refugees, they endure significant challenges to come here, right? The forced immigration is a prime example of how that can be traumatic, right? Someone been forced to flee their home country and home community because of violence, war, crime, and extreme poverty, right? These are the factors that made the traumatic experience that they carry, and they didn't have the time to process or deal with, right? Like coming to a new country to assimilate, adjust that. It can be very traumatic and challenging. And one of the symptoms for traumas and depression is the feeling of isolation. I had talked about extensively here already, right? Like that with the immigration alone, that the feelings of isolation. Oftentimes people move as an individual union or family union, right? You normally don't see like a whole community like move all together. It's often like actually a very smaller scale with the immigration status. And then they might have to find like the community they belong, understand that immigration stories and the struggles that they have. So oftentimes that create that the isolation, they don't see the stories can be understood. It's not being shared publicly. It's not what we see in the public and in the media. It's something that they hide in themselves because it's a trauma, right? Like a lot of cultural stigma there as well. Do people tend to hide those trauma to themselves? It's harder for them to build that connection, and that they carry that emotional pain with them. And people with, I think, unauthorized to work with undocumented status, like they no pathway to citizenship. These are the people that are at risk for deportation and family separation. So these chronic worries and stress that they have cause a tremendous amount of trauma, and that's hindered their ability to feel belong in the United States. And with the individual trauma, there's a lot of work I know in the community. A lot of people work on trauma-informed care to address that. But there's also that stigma of accepting help, fear of interacting with anything that's like a formal system, right? Like anything that can have something to do with authority, that fear. And I think a lot of it has that to do with that trust issue as well. Like that created a barrier for them to access help and also looking for help. With an immigrant trauma, at an individual level, we oftentimes also see that at the family level. So that intergenerational trauma is also true. Children of immigrants often carry the weight of their parents' experience, and that leading to a lot of feelings of loss and grief and guilt and shame, loss of self-worth, loss of sense of self. And those intergenerational trauma can be manifested in many ways. The first way with the intergenerational trauma is how they relate to themselves. So children of immigrants, like what they heard or observed in the family is what they learn, like what's the norm, right? Like they are going to take that and repeat that pattern because they see that's how their parents and grandparents cope with stress and trauma. When I mentioned about the immigration itself is traumatic, right? Like there's a lot of abandonment that happened there. Willingly or unwillingly, they had to leave a part of themselves and home country, right? They had to abandon the physical home that they had, whatever that looked like, some of the language, some of the cultural practice, they had to leave probably some loved ones behind, right? There's a lot of abandonment that happened in that process, and it was traumatic for many of them. And then they continue to abandon, some of them continue to abandon part of themselves when they integrate to the society because there's a need for them to assimilate. Thinking about the first and second immigrant generation, first and second generation immigrant, they had to really sacrifice, compromise part of that themselves to assimilate, because assimilation actually means safety, physical safety for some of them. So there's a need for pushing that behaviors, right? Reinforce that behaviors over the time. And children immigrants to see that process, right? See what it takes to assimilate, to see what it takes to feel safe in the society, and they repeat the pattern, and they abandon part of themselves as well. So, and there's still actually a lot of sense of like a cultural loss of cultural for the first and second generation, right? Again, that's because there's that filter down the cultural practice, and also that sense of I want to hold on to something, but it's very hard at the current society, right? And also with that abandonment, right? There's a sense of you don't feel truly belong at the host community, but when you went back home, home looks very different than the home that you remember. Immigration happens almost like with immigration that happens at a period of time. So what they remember was back home also stop at that what was that period of time. When they go back home, and then that's another loss and grief that they experience, that home doesn't feel like home anymore because so many things has moved on. The memories that they have is only for that period of the time, and they locked into what they remember, right? Even when things hasn't changed, but maybe the people has changed there, right? Like the physical, the infrastructure has changed. The home that they have doesn't feel like a home anymore. So that again, that left that in between with a lot, there's not that much clarity of them where exactly is home, right? Like that's like not that much place for them to process until really putting fingers on what I'm experiencing. I just feel like I wanted to connect, but I thought going home, right, visiting home is a way to resolve that homesick, or feel like there's actually a place I belong. But even back home, when they don't feel belong, they're forever in that in between status and with their cultural identity as well. So that's how they relate to themselves with the intergenerational trauma. Another one is, I think it shows up with generation trauma, is a boundary setting. And that's a big one, right? Like I think interpersonal relationship starts with healthy boundary, but if someone's struggling with setting a healthy and meaningful boundary, it's harder for them to form a healthy and meaningful relationship. And at the core for the boundary issue in the interpersonal relationship, I think is the deeper human desire for connection. So all the immigrants, like with the Maslow hierarchy needs, they are actually seeking for non-connection. But when there's a lack of skills, a lack of understanding of what boundary looks like, right? And a lot of times that because of the fear of abandonment, they haven't seen that, witnessed or experienced that themselves. The fear of abandonment actually made it harder for them to have a healthy behavior. So boundary violation, right? Because I'm so afraid of being abandoned again, losing something very important again, I'm going to maybe violate boundary a little bit, right? That's like maybe texting someone so often, maybe call someone so often, and maybe I had just a hold on to with parent or children relationship, right? The parents can be invasive, like a whole the control, the type of control that they need to have to feel like they are finally in control, right? All these unhealthy practice builds into the boundary issues that they have, and that stems from the fear of abandonment. That's not coming from like a really a negative place. That carried a lot of trauma, and how they relate to themselves and how that trauma influence their decision making and their behaviors. And with the trauma, there's also lots of grief. And I think even just immigration alone, right? You had to leave some, there's the pulling force and pushing force for someone to finally make the decision to immigrate. Um, there's a lot of loss that can happen in that process. So whenever there is a loss, there's a grief as well. So immigrants often experience grief that's related to leaving their home country. So many things can get lost in this process, including like cultural practice, the social network that they had before, loss of the identity, right? Part of them to reestablish the new identity that they see themselves. And they might have to lose some of the social status. And I have heard people like in order for them to immigrate, they had to maybe abandon some of the things that they had before. The example of some of the refugee communities coming here, they might practice as a physician at their home country, but because they don't have a license, and because there's such a huge need for economic security, they had to pursue job opportunity that's not in the healthcare, right? Or even just starting with like housekeeping or some of the lower entry level job in order to survive. So in that process, they lost a lot of that professional identity and the social status that where they had. And those lost, a lot of time it's unspoken in the family, right? Because there's a lot of shame and guilt in process that people suppress this thing so hard that they, and I think holding to themselves until they show up in a different way, like a form of control or boundary violation, and that gets reinforced at the family unit. Another thing about grief is this unique grief that is experienced by the immigrant community, and that's the transnational grief. So transnational grief happens when someone lose their loved one when they live in another country, and they are not able to experience that grief directly because the distance. And because the distance is also hard for them to have the final closure, right? It's not about the sometimes it's unintentionally, unknowingly you are not able to make it back on time to spend the former time with someone. So that process creates a lot of guilt and shame when someone's unable to experience that loss at the final stage of someone's life, where if it was accident that happened, that distance prevented them to fully engage in that process. That's a lot of guilt and shame, and a lot of loss of control on someone's end, and that hinder their ability, right? Like that, because that's very unique for them to experience. It's harder for them to talk about, right? It might be a very unique population here. Like they might have a large social network still in another country, but they're here alone in the United States. So when that happened, and there's a lot of that doubt, right? Am I making a right decision? If there's immigration status gets in the way, that's further complicated this grief, right? Like immigration status sometimes it's making it harder for someone um, make it to leave the country, right? Like there might be paperwork involved, there might be complication involved so someone's not able to actually be there for the loss and the grief that's happening in another country. So this transnational grief also is a type of trauma, right? Like there's the profound loss of control and the profound losing, like devastating feeling of losing someone when you know that if you don't have to experience this as an immigrant, right, this wouldn't be part of that experience. There's a lot of that regret and guilt that's going on in there. So these are like some of the traumas I think that's prevalent, and that's important for us to consider when we work with immigrant community, and then understanding this broader context of connection and belonging, how they see themselves. And the next piece is resilience. Resilience is a coping mechanism, and it's this ability idea to be bounced back to where they were, so they can adapt and adjust in a positive way to any challenges and overcome the adversities that's in their life. Despite those trauma and the challenges immigrants face, resilience often time give someone that sense of hope. Many immigrants that I work with, they're actually incredibly resilient. They have incredible, amazing strength that help them navigate and adjust to the life in the new country. And with the resilience perspective, that offers us some hope as a service provider to focus on the strengths and adapting copinism that's probably already in there for them. It just needs to be cultivated. So here are some of the factors, at least here, for factors that can affecting the resilience and enhance someone's ability to adapt. The first one's the emotional strength, right? Like for someone that has the emotional strength of positive, right, hope, so future oriented, looking forward to something, right? If they can think it differently, right? Like that's the emotional strength for them. So when it comes to that cognitive reframing, that's really powerful, right? What kind of narratives do they tell themselves? Is this all about pain and suffering, right? Or is this also about hope and growth and opportunity? Can they reframe that life immigration status is hard, but also it's opportunity for me to grow? Are they able to think from a more dialectical way, more balanced way? That's if they can do that, right? That's a lot of strength to cultivate it there to help them to see the resilient side of themselves and their ability to adapt new challenges. So how the behavioral adaptability, like how can we work with them to improve that behavioral flexibility, right? They had to be open-minded, where someone's more open-minded and flexible, more likely they are going to be resilient and be flexible with the challenges that they're facing. Cultural acceptance is also a factor that's contributing to resilience. So cultural acceptance speaks about this ability to embrace someone's cultural heritage and be proud of the cultural heritage that they have and be proud of who they are. That's going to help them foster a lot of sense of belonging and hold on to that identity. And so almost like the anchor, like a beacon to a buffer against the stress if they do feel like they can be accepted their own culture, right? Like part of that self-othering, self-alienation start with the work within themselves. They had to accept and appreciate who they are, embrace part of the healing and wound and embrace the culture that they're coming from. So that help with foster that cultural acceptance. With when someone's truly accept themselves, they can move on to the social connection, right? Looking for the connection from peers and the community, and sometimes even the bigger organization that can provide them with the emotional support that they need in the process. The same goes with opportunities for education and employment. When someone has better opportunities that can be provided to them, more likely they can be resilient, they can be resourceful, and that build into the overall life satisfaction. There's a lot of research that I shared earlier that shows us with the life satisfaction that correlates with a greater sense of belonging and vice versa, right? You belong somewhere that more likely you will feel better about the quality of life that someone has. And the last piece is the religious piece, the religious motivation. I think a religion oftentimes felt like a cultural anchor in the new environment. Religion practice where religion community provided is actually a very strong social network and a source of meaning and a purpose. And so utilize if someone belongs to a religious or spiritual community and hold out on their identity, that's another piece for us to look at. How can we utilize that to help them feel connected, especially when they face challenges with acculturation and assimilation. Religion is right, whatever religion that they have, it's a way of bringing them together, and that can help reduce that potential isolation that's going to happen with the immigration journey. And the religion practice is also another important piece. And it's a coping mechanism, right? Like that can help manage stress and anxiety associated with the migration process. So with religion, actually, theirs comes with a lot of resilience that help them build that social connection and also help them to, as a coping mechanism, right? Prayer many times, a lot of times can be seen as a mindfulness practice, right? Like that help with mindful practice, and there's a lot of benefits of reducing the anxiety and the stress. So that's if they already have a religion or something they would like to explore, have a spiritual identity. It doesn't have to be that physical community they're holding to. Again, it can be many forms of building a connection with the community. Sometimes it can be online space to have that type of connection or keep that connection with someone. And then it's the final piece is the behavioral health interventions. And so we talk a lot about what kind of things that's influencing and impacting the sense of belonging, and then what from different perspective. The next part is what we're going to do to help with interventions. And these are the behavioral health interventions specifically. But I also wanted just to point it out here. There's a bigger things, right? As a society, as a community, at a bigger scale level from what we share from the person environment, right? Like these are the intervention that happen at the community, the smaller scale level. But also, I think as a society, there's a much more like advocacy work that we can do to make sure the assimilation process, right, refugee resettlement, these are make sure those processes are provided, right? There's a process in place for them to feel included and welcome and navigate this challenge, so they don't feel like they had to do that alone. They had to search for a community alone when there's already like resource in place for them. So I think it's important to recognize this that well. But I'm going to talk about two behavioral health interventions that I found helpful working with immigrants. And the first one is actually very effective intervention with the culturally diverse population. So the first one is culturally affirming care. This is an approach that focuses on the understanding, validating of someone's cultural backgrounds and experience, and with culturally affirming the care, and that is especially beneficial for people who are historically being marginalized or experience cultural discrimination or social alienation. It helped the clients to understand, and validated and empower them to use their own cultural strengths and seeing the cultural strengths within them so they can use that to overcome some of the challenges along the way. It is about acknowledging and respect the cultural background, right? And building to the cultural competency. You don't have to be on the exact same cultural background. And oftentimes I find that it's really challenging because it's such a diverse population I would work with. It's harder to have that exact same cultural background, even if that does, right? With intersectionality, you might not fully understand someone's experience. So a lot of time that looks like with cultural competency, right? It's just to be humble and accepting and the willingness and have the curiosity to learn about someone's cultural background and the migration experience and allow them to incorporate some cultural relevant practice into therapy, right? Is that ritual? Is that is that like a religious prayer, right? What kind of things that's culturally relevant and affirming to them? What kind of language you want to use with the providers and the therapist, with the providers and the clients, and help them understand the family dynamic and think all these things and help with the culturally affirming. Someone feel like they're there, they do matter because their culture wanted to is going to be explored and understood, and also help foster this connection with them reflecting on the cultural background they have, what kind of power and the strengths that they have within themselves. So some of the key aspect of this approach is building trust. I think I put that on the first. That just goes to every therapeutic relationship. The foundation is to have the trust. I think working with this community, I think there's a lot of mistrust, a lot of hurts that happen along the way because the trauma that they carry with them. So building a safe place and building trust with them, I think is first and foremost. And that's with the building trust that can be reinforced by some of the techniques like just the basic human decency that you show to someone, be empathetic, right? Show the respect, actively listening to their stories. And one of the most important story, I think, when someone coming in for service and mental health support is ask about their immigration stories. If you have an immigrant and they might come in for many million different reasons, they might not be coming for like what they, for immigration related stress. They might come in for family conflicts. They might come in for a marriage issue, right? But I think it's essential to ask about those immigration stories and learn about the country of origin they're coming from, what kind of stories that they tell themselves, right? With children of immigrants, what kind of stories that they were told and not being told, right? What does that mean to the family, right? Is there trauma? Is there like something that's embarrassed, something that wanted to be hide and suppress in the family, right? And what kind of challenges that they face in the new environment? And how did they overcome that, right? Like what kind of strengths and resilience that they have in themselves? What kind of barriers that they experience when they try to navigate and find a community where they feel belong, right? These, I think, immigration that just shows a lot when you see someone working with immigrant like that. I think that shows a signal like that immigration story matter. The experience that they have is not for nothing, right? It's a culturally that's relevant and important to understand the presenting problems, right? Like why is the marriage conflicts does the marriage conflict happen before and after immigration, right? I think all these are very relevant even before we get to what's really happening here. These are the backstories that we want to understand. Same with I think psychoanalysis asks a lot of stories about childhood experience. I think working with immigrants is that same mindset, right? Like there's a lot of building to what they're seeing here. What kind of things that the new identity, how that was formed with immigrants coming to the new country. So asking about those immigration stories is actually really crucial for us to understand that. The other part is validating cultural values and beliefs. And I think that that's also huge to understand the thoughts and process, right? Of course, it makes sense when someone's coming from more of the collectivism, right, versus the individualism culture. Like, of course, it makes sense to them and validating because they might have a lot of conflicting feelings that they're going through, where they see a lot of people in the host community have one cultural practice, right? I think boundary setting is a classic example that happens, right? Boundary setting is so easy for the is a concept that's well understood and accepted um, in the individualism environment versus someone that's working with Asian immigrants, right? Like I think collectivism and that's really present in their cultural practice. So if there's a lot of that conflict someone going through about like I can't really set a boundary. Like setting boundary for Asian immigrant community families is almost felt like a taboo or even felt like threatening, right? Like, what do you mean? Like, I had to set a boundary with my family when there's no boundary to begin with? Because a family function comes first before the individual's needs, right? And that created a lot of the cultural practice and the behaviors we're seeing, right? So I think even validating that conflicts or validating what makes sense because the cultural backgrounds and beliefs that they have is important for them to feel like their culture is being affirmed. Another thing is to use the language, right? Be mindful of how some of the language nuance can be interpreted differently across cultural. The example I talk about is a boundary. That's I think that's well known and well understood, and it's still a relatively new concept in some cultural where they had to learn like it's just even appropriate, right? Like so, I think just to be more mindful and even and with the language too in the surveys, right? So for some, a lot of the immigrants, they are bicultural and bilingual as well. So what kind of language makes sense to them to use, right? That's the, even if they're fluent English, that has to be right, like the language of a choice. Which language do they feel like more easier for them to access their emotions, right? What kind of language actually speak to heart? So allowing them to choose the language. And also the other piece is address the acculturation stresses. So the stress along the way, the cultural heritage that they have, and when they try to navigate that with the dominant culture they are seeing here, there are a lot of the stress that's happening. Even just checking with them, right? How are you feeling, right? There may be a checking with them on the important cultural holidays. How do you feel about celebrating this holiday? Now you're here versus back home because you might not have that same environment that you are going through. And the two practice I put it here is narrative therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. I think the combination of both, I find that really helpful working with this type of population. So the narrative therapy is going to allow people to tell their immigration story, tell their story along the way. And then with the cognitive behavioral therapy, helps them in that process to when they tell the stories to challenge and combat some of the cognitive distortions and unhelpful thinking that they have. The next one I will just mention briefly because I feel like this is a whole another presentation we can go on here is about trauma-informed care. Trauma, we touch a lot about the trauma is actually very resilient community, but they carry a lot of trauma. So trauma-informed care is definitely a critical intervention when we recognize the impact of the trauma and the intergenerational trauma that we talk about in the immigrant community, how that show up and how that's established. So I put some like a core things here for the core principles of trauma-informed care that goes with establish safety and trustworthiness at first, the building that trust and create a safe space, and then goes to the peer support and collaboration, and empower the clients because a lot of time there's a profound loss of control and loss of connection. So even just empowering them to make a decision for themselves, allowing them to tell the story the way they want to, I think that's also very important. And I know with Nationality Service Center, they actually offer CEUs and training on trauma-informed care to actually for immigrants and refugee communities. So that's another resource for you guys to consider. And I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but I just want to point out here that trauma-informed care is essentially very critical for the community that we serve. And these are some of my references. And thank you so much for listening to me and allowing me to just share some of the insights that I have. It's really a great experience and feel really honored and privileged to be here. And I will go to Suzanne to see if we have some questions or comments that we have a few minutes left and we can use the time to address that.
Yeah, so I can read it out to you, or if you want to go into the Q&A. Someone actually had a couple scenarios from therapy that they wanted some feedback on. So they said, in light of belonging, how would you respond to the following situations in therapy? So the first situation is a client was being raised till they were 8 years old in China. When asked about their cultural background, they say they don't consider themselves Chinese because their parents were abusive. So they're asking, how would you handle that in therapy? How would you respond? And then they have another question as well.
Thank you. And I think that's a lot of trauma there, right? I think that the first we hear that is the resistance to their cultural background, right? Like I think it's that denial or refusal, almost like it's someone being willful, like I'm not Chinese because I don't want to be part of that. As being Chinese meaning like maybe the cultural background they're coming from, that's associated with trauma, right? In this scenario is abuse, right? I think even working through, I think the first is to establish the safety, right? Maybe validate, of course you felt that way because the meaning this cultural background actually you made the assumption that you made, right? The thought process they have is like very like overgeneralized, right? You have a one parent, they have maybe one or two parents that's abusive, that they're Chinese and overgeneralize this whole population. So it definitely like the whole population I don't want to relate to. And I think I was working with immigrants, that there's a lot of that black and white thinking. Either I am this or I'm not, because I'm absolutely don't want to be associated with that. So I think what's important is validating that experience of course you felt this way, but actually what's behind this is a lot of pain and trauma. So right, the sense of belonging, but you can't feel truly connected until we resolve this trauma and what's this resistance and refusal that you have with cultural identity, right? Is it just about your parents? Did somebody else hurt you, right? I think it's a lot of that to explore with the trauma, and definitely trauma informed care will be that intervention. I think will make sense to use here.
Great, great. The second part of that question was, when asked about their cultural background, a participant states, I don't know what I am. How would you respond to that in therapy?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really valid feeling. A lot of people don't know what they are, right? Maybe they knew and that kind of get lost in the process. I think it's a lot of identity issue here we're seeing. And I think that's absolutely true with the immigrant community. They don't know who they are, right? If someone, even me, right, as an immigrant, like, am I really Chinese, right? Am I really like what? Because a lot of cultural practice like it feels like foreign when you don't. There's a lot that goes into that. So when you don't know, I think it just even just point out it makes sense. A lot of people feel this way. A lot of people are trying to explore that. That's a part of that. There's that common humanity as immigrant community. It's a lot of time that social alienation is like I feel like I'm the only one's this. I'm the only one that's confused about my identity. When in reality, it can be normalized. And many people ask themselves, right, who am I? Like, am I going to become? Really, it's that a lot of feelings behind it. I think it's a lot of the fear of losing part of self, a fear of not knowing, right? A fear of I don't have an anchor, a cultural anchor for myself, right? Like this goes beyond, and then there's a lot of that anxiety about like who am I becoming? What kind of things I feel connect to? Where is my community? So I think even just to explore like you don't know who you are, right? Like that, I think that's a so relevant question. So and then nobody does, right? Nobody truly does, right? But what kind of, right? I think what kind of things that they go to practice, right? A lot of time, I think another thing is people often handle the truth like I'm not 100% this or that because rather because my immigration story. And that's also like the black and white, right? I'm not Chinese enough, I'm not American enough. I hear this thing, right? Like, but a lot of time it's like, can you just be in your body, being a Chinese body? Is that enough, right? Like, I think with that, can explore like who do you when you say you don't know who you are, like what kind of cultural practice, what kind of things you relate to? And it's okay to have that in-between ambiguity in your identity. And a lot of people work through that in different stages in their life. Right, like it's not just going to stop one right here. A lot of times that feeling is this is never going to stop. I'm just going to be forever confused. And it's, I think, a very, very dynamic with sense of belonging, very dynamic. It can change from time to time and from place to place.
Great. So I do want to mention that technically the session is over, but we do have 2 more questions in the chat. So I'll keep the session open for a few more minutes. But if you need to leave, that's okay. Oh, we have 3 more questions. So the next one from Casey, she asks, or he asks, is Mango Tree a nonprofit organization? How was it created or founded? I am from Pittsburgh and would love to work toward establishing something like that here.
That's a great question. Yeah, it is a nonprofit. I think it created by our founder, Dr. Novel Marazzi. He is incredibly recognizing there's such a need providing cultural affirming care. So there's actually very few Asian American, Asian immigrants based mental health organization. I think because the language barrier, because there's such needs there, but it's never been created. So we were established in 2022. It's relatively new practice, but we're growing since then. Now we have like a 30 plus providers and serving like very large communities. And we provide services in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So if you wanted to connect, we would love to just hear more. If you go to our website, Mango Tree Counseling Consulting, there's a way you can get you connected. We would like to also hear what you have in mind. And I'm very excited to hear someone find that meaningful. And I do. I think that there's such a need there in the community, and we're able to adjust that with what we have.
Great. Okay, the next question, how do you make this therapy appropriate for children who have immigrated to the US because their parents sent them to live here with a sponsor that they have not seen in many years or maybe never met before?
I'm not sure if I understand if they never met the parents when they never met the.
I think they're saying they never met the sponsor. So they're being sent to the US to live with someone, a family member or sponsor that they maybe don't even know. And how to support a child who is facing that kind of immigration situation.
Yeah, I think that's very challenging. There's actually a term called a parachute child to describe that situation, meaning someone almost like just drop off by the fly, which most of the case they are. They are sent off here with very little preparation, with what's coming ahead of them. I think a lot of adjustment here, right? Like, I think that's a separation from the family of origin. So that's alone very stressful. And with the sponsor here that they never met, right? Like that's a lot of uncertainty unknown that's going to cause those anxiety and the stress. So I think the process alone is to explore what they have, right? What I think they explore what they're bringing with their history trauma and what cultural familiarity, right? Like maybe I was assuming that this is going to be extremely challenging. Maybe there's something they're looking forward to. What kind of relationship, right? I think with a sponsor, that's I think good to know there have someone that's is well established in the host community that can receive them, right? Like what kind of resource, right, we can use from this sponsor to help the children navigate. And I think with the children, depends on the age. I think age 8 or 12, that's the development age where they're searching for a lot of a sense of self and identity. So having a peer support, in addition to the sponsor that already have a peer support is very important in that life stage where they're developing that peer relationship, and that's where they actually go to see themselves. So having a peer relationship with the school they're going to, or with maybe children, the child immigrants, with that same process, right? Like establish that connection. That's going to help to foster that sense of belonging for someone.
Thank you. Okay, I am going to read the last question and then I have to sign off and go start one of the other sessions, but I'll just leave this open so whoever wants to stay and listen to your responses can. So the last question in the chat is, thank you so much for your shares. I really enjoyed the session. Have you ever experienced vicarious trauma in your practice with immigrants, and any suggestions on how to deal with the feelings?
Vicarious trauma, yeah, thank you. For sure. I think it's not just working with the immigrant community. I think a lot of service providers, the sense of from burnout, from hearing so many traumatic stories, right? Oftentimes, I think working with immigrants, there are so many loss and trauma, and that a lot of trauma that's not by choice, right? A lot of the immigrants, some are even from economic or here for education, right? These some felt like they might not be, they even that way. So there's a trauma associated with adjusting to something brand new that they never experienced before. So I think as a service provider, vicarious trauma is true, and the burnout is actually very true, right? Working with that. It's this goes back to self-care for therapists. I think someone shared at the beginning of the remarks, right? We take care of people that's being hurt, that has a lot of hurts, past hurts that carry with them. So self-care to us, even I think allowing us to get in touch with our own emotions, right? These are some of the sad stories that we hear, right? Can we also, and I think as immigrant working with immigrants, there's that piece of like this is getting too real for myself. And like that adding to that piece was that vicarious trauma, because it might be some of the things that our therapists experience when working with immigrants that might share the similar stories, the experience that they have. And so it goes back to, I think, to take care of ourselves. When self-care comes in different forms, there that physical needs, emotional self-care, I think is very important, and that connection, interpersonal connection that we have. So I think this is a relevant practice, and in the community, we don't talk a lot about that. I think working with Asian immigrants, particularly, there's that the work ethics things that's also going on, that the people have to keep going with vicarious trauma. You look like you might need to take a break. You need to take a step back to observe what's happening, right? Like the burnout is not just from overworking. It can be from like the emotional piece, the emotional labor that we do. So even just have a moment of taking back, reflect, and then absorb what's really happening. And supervision, right? Supervision that's going to be helpful in getting the help, right? Getting the help that you need, and knowing the limits and knowing the support that you need from a supervisor to process those vicarious trauma is also going to be helpful in this process. All right. I hope I think that's all the questions that we have. So thank you again for everyone that was part of this presentation. It is at 10:59, so you might have another session you want to go to. So, and we will hopefully connect during the lunch break. So thank you again, and have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.